Now time to introduce our first of our keynote speakers today, Dr. Jillann Farmer. Jillann Farmer is the Director of the Medical Services Division of the United Nations, based at their headquarters in New York. Prior to this, she was the Medical Director of Patient Safety Centre in Queensland Health and the inaugural Director of the Clinician Performance Support Service. Jillann has worked for the Medical Board of Queensland, Medicare Australia, and was the Director of Medical Services at the Caboolture Hospital. Now, in her current role, which she took up in October 2012, Jillann has overarching responsibility for the UN's internal healthcare system, which involves care for staff dispersed throughout the world, sometimes in difficult and dangerous locations. And in 2014, she led the UN's health services responsible for staff serving in the Ebola Outbreak area. It's extraordinary to listen to, so please make sure your phones are off and you're respectful. Take a seat if you're standing up the back, because I think the next 20 minutes is going to be really engaging. There are plenty of seats up the back, so if you want to come down, there are plenty of seats up the front here if you'd like to join in. And please welcome to the stage Dr. Jillann Farmer. Nice to see you.
Thank you, and I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land. Thank you for that wonderful welcome to country, and it's been a privilege to learn a little about the Larrakia people as I went on my walk this morning to see some of the signs and explanations. And I acknowledge the elders past, present and future. Thank you. It is so wonderful to be here, an opportunity to return almost home, and to just land and be surrounded by so many Australian accents is just a wonderful feeling. And to be able to ask for something without having to explain that a flat white does not have 300 millilitres of milk in it, thank you very much. So it's wonderful to be here today, but some of you may be scratching your heads. What is a person from New York doing talking about rural and remote medicine? And indeed, New York is not very rural. It's fairly remote from here, but not in the sense that I think you intend it to be for this conference. But I have had the privilege of a fairly extraordinary journey, and I, from time to time, scratch my head and ponder how this could have been. And I hope that by sharing some of my story today, some of you may see some other possibilities of how things might pan out during or after you've enjoyed your career in rural and remote areas. So the UN's got a workforce of 100,000 staff and 100,000 uniformed personnel, the blue helmets that you would be familiar with. We've got 193 member states, and each one of them nearly all of them have staff employed in the UN, and roughly 30 of them deploy medical capabilities for us in the form of military hospitals that we deploy into our peacekeeping missions. We work in some very medically challenging areas. Remote trauma is almost a daily occurrence for us, particularly for our troops. And my job is to oversee the system of healthcare that keeps the civilian and military personnel fit to work and responding and rescuing them when things go wrong. So we have 437 healthcare facilities, the last time I counted, but it can be difficult to keep track. There are offices away from headquarters in the cities that you would recognise as UN hubs, such as Geneva, Vienna, Nairobi, and we've got little UN clinics, which actually I think are some of the tougher gigs, because they're often 1 or 2 doctor clinics located in usually the capital city of a country that is in a very resource-poor economy, and we operate those clinics only when the local health infrastructure is not sufficient to support UN personnel to an adequate standard of healthcare. So the UNDP doctors and nurses who work in those clinics have a very similar role in many regards to the doctors who are working in rural and or remote Australia, particularly remote, because there are often a lack of hospital capability there as well. In peacekeeping, we operate 77 civilian clinics, which are the ones that the doctors who are actually employed by the UN work for, 293 troop-operated facilities. So when a member state, for example, let's think Chad, sends troops along to us, one of the requirements we ask them to do is to send medical capability with that as well. We've got 23 level 2 hospitals, which are very similar to what you would regard as your secondary hospitals here or community facilities. operating in smaller towns, and my time as the Director of Medical Services at Caboolture back then, when it was I think it was a 185-bed hospital, it's a very similar scope of practice that we operate in our level 2 hospitals, and we've got a couple of level 3s that allow us to provide a higher level of care, particularly when there's a catastrophic event. About 6 months ago, there was a massacre of UN troops. They came under fire in DRC, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. They were pinned down. We took about 30 fatalities that night and about 56 injured. And they were, mobilised a massive medical evacuation exercise and dispersed them throughout the facilities that we had. We had a level 3 facility operated by India and that site, and they worked miracles. And the amazing thing, and I get tingles when I talk about it, not a single soldier who made it to hospital alive died. And so in these remote and difficult locations, the doctors and nurses who work in these UN facilities perform amazing feats of life-saving care. So I'll give you an overview of my journey to the UN, about the risks and the rewards, the journey of self-belief and self-doubt, which I think we all experience. Every time you come across something, it's, can I do this? Oh, hell, I have to do this. The successes and sometimes the frustrations, the growth and getting stuck, because we all have times when our growth comes easily to us, when we rise to meet challenges and surprise ourselves. And we all have times when we just seem to be stuck and we can't find a different way of operating. We're failing to get the results that we need and have to undertake some pretty serious self-reflection and a change in the way we engage with the world. There have been times when the UN has tried to make me be quiet, and that's not an easy thing to do, as any of you who know me would, but it can be pretty intimidating to be just told that your opinion doesn't have weight, particularly when that's coming from extremely senior ambassadors or diplomats. And then finding a way to get them to listen, and that being then leading to some really important reforms in the UN's healthcare system. So I want to be really clear that I'm not an expert. I'm not really an expert at anything, but that's a strength. Because with that lack of deep expertise in any one thing comes that breadth, and I think in general practice we become quite comfortable with that. Many of our specialist colleagues in the organ-specific or system-specific specialties can't come to terms with how we can possibly cope with being able to leap from endocrine medicine to an acute abdomen to obstetric care to psychiatry, all in the space of a single morning session. But that breadth is a great strength. So I'm not a great expert at anything, and I don't want to be pretending that I'm perfect. I still make mistakes. I've been constantly struggling to come to terms with this incredibly complex environment in which I work. But my view is that I don't think I'm very different to most of the people in the room. I've made some slightly odd choices as my career has gone along, and those choices have kind of come together into something. And I certainly didn't wake up one day in medical school and go, oh, I want to be the medical director of the UN. That was, I didn't even know the job existed until I saw it advertised. So it was not something that I was systematically working towards, but put together a career that led me to here by following my heart and following the opportunities that resonated with me. And in fact, often taking the jobs that nobody else wanted, because that's a real pathway where you can forge success and define it for yourself. So how did that happen? Long ago in Australia, I was just starting to think it was time to exit Queensland Health. I could see sort of that everything starting to change, and I didn't think the job that I was doing would survive. And I went to a course and I met a couple of women who were working for the UN, and I truly thought, so spectacular, I think I could probably do what you do, perhaps better. And so on the way home in the plane, someone handed me a copy of The Economist, and I opened it and there were all these UN jobs advertised. So I took out a subscription to The Economist and thought, I'm going to have a go at this. But I thought I would be walking away from medicine. I wanted to do something different, and I thought I would play on my management skills, my project management program capabilities, and I was really prepared to try anything. But the second or third edition of that subscription that got delivered to my door had the advertisement for the Director of Medical Services. And my lovely husband said, yes, dear, you apply for that. You apply. Go, girl. And then I got an interview, and then I got another interview, and then came the offer, and his response was, "Oh, hell, it's the UN, you can't really say no." So I packed my bags and moved to New York, but left him in Queensland. Realising how much I would travel, it seemed a little unfair to make him move to New York just for me to abandon him while I jetted around the world. So in a nutshell, I went from single patient interactions through the normal training programs. I did internship, residency, practiced in general practice, completed the FRAC GP, because at that time I was city bound. I eventually arrived at hospital administration, so I was dealing with a hospital. And then I ended up dealing with a state, and I had a couple of national roles there, and now this is my world. I had one of those moments when I walked into my office in the UN headquarters, and when I'd been working at the Patient Safety Centre, I had a map of Queensland on my wall so that I could sort of work out where everything was. And I walked into my office at the UN on my first day, and there's this map of the world on the wall. I was like, oh my God, what have I done? So many places, the names of which I couldn't even pronounce. And good luck with pronouncing some of these fantastic acronyms. I'm still trying to work out how to pronounce, oh, that moved ahead. Still trying to work out how to pronounce MINUJUSV at the bottom. And the thing that makes the UN acronyms even more entertaining is that without even telling you, many of them are actually French acronyms. And so when you're trying to make sense of it in English, it just doesn't work. So you have to be a little bit bilingual to be able to navigate all of the acronyms. So I went from the bush. My home in Queensland is out in Samford. We've got 7 acres of land for wildlife. We've got nest boxes everywhere, resident wallabies, and I truly do meet wallabies in my back garden, which is the classic stereotype. And that's sort of home. And then the picture on the right is the view from my apartment. And it's quite a contrast. The biggest thing I notice when I leave New York is the absence of the sirens. So I went from a very calm and serene environment to chaos. I went from an incredibly well-resourced healthcare system to something a little less well-resourced to some things that are truly horrendous. And these pictures that one of my colleagues brought back from Mali was an inspiration to start a comprehensive program of reform and accountability with the member states, who up until then had been allowed to insert whatever they wanted and call it healthcare capability. And we've now got an entire system in place to hold them to account for that and say, I'm sorry, that's not good enough. So this is a pharmacy and a pathology laboratory and a resus bay and an outpatient clinic. So these were the conditions that UN personnel were being treated in about 4 years ago. It's not all fixed yet, but we're well on the way. So to take this on, I had to come to terms with the fact that I truly knew nothing. And, that's a big leap from a person who's going to go, hell yeah, I can apply for a job at the UN and get it. That's a high degree of self-belief. To then arrive and realise that I really did know nothing. And I had to confront my own biases. And that was also a significant time of reflection. It is my view that Australia remains a deeply racist country. It may not be a view that is shared by everyone in this room, but having seen my own inner dialogues and the automatic stereotyping and inadvertent bias that I confronted in myself, that I had been so unaware of when I was living and working in Australia, I had to come to terms with that. I had to challenge my own assumptions, and I did have to crash burn and be publicly humiliated. I have had some astounding circumstances where I thought I had everything lined up, only to have the people that I thought would support me in forums bigger than this just stand up and completely trounce it. I had to learn to work the politics, something that I had previously really avoided because I despised political players. But I've had to learn how to flex and work the politics when it is necessary to do so. And sometimes to do it, to get things done, I have sometimes had to get down and fight dirty. And that, I've had to choose, do I want to be really effective, or do I want to constantly be able to say that I'm above all that? And one of the things that I've had to do is accept that the most important thing to me is to be effective, to get things done, even if that sometimes means working in ways that would not be my preferred way of working. You know, I'm a purist. I want things to succeed simply by virtue that it's the right thing to do. But the real world doesn't work like that. And so it's all about understanding other people's perspectives and pulling them into supporting something to move forward. And sometimes it means lobbying and politicking and going through the back doors. So the toolkit that I took with me into this job was an FRA CGP and a FRACMA. Supposedly very generic competencies, but developed in a really specific environment. And honestly, some of my competencies were little bonsai trees that had sort of been in a little tiny pot and had never really needed to grow. And so this journey was about taking those competencies where I was weak and making them stronger and find new ways to apply them in a really different environment. And in the medical service directly in New York, I've got roughly 45 different nationalities working there, each with their own culture, each with their own norms and standards of what constitutes appropriate medical ethics and practice. And attempting to impose an Australian concept of that onto that group was a guaranteed disaster. So it's about learning, growing and recognising that I don't necessarily have all of the solutions. So for the last little bit, I'm going to show you just some pictures of this different world that I have been inhabiting and give you some reflections. So this was a moment when I was flying into Dadaab, which is it's 80 kilometres south of the Kenya-Somali border. And the Dadaab refugee camp is one of the largest refugee camps in the world, hundreds of thousands of people. I think it was 300,000 people. It used to be the largest, but I think the Rohingya camps in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh are now really starting to push that envelope. But this is a generational refugee camp. There are people who were born there for 3 generations who've never known what it's like to not live in a refugee camp. This is one of my best days at the office ever. I had to go into the Ebola outbreak, but Liberia, Guinea and Sierra Leone, huge area. And I needed to visit our different healthcare facilities and just assist them to be ready and be prepared to deal with Ebola. We had a lot of clinicians there who were very, very afraid, and rightly so. Healthcare workers were dying at a disproportionate rate. Not only were they having high rates of infection, but the fatality rate amongst healthcare workers was higher than the fatality rate in the general population, probably relating to the degree of the inoculum with which they were infected. So when I went into the Ebola outbreak area, it was about visiting those facilities, assessing their readiness, assessing their infection control, identifying what support they needed to be better prepared to deal with those sporadic cases that could come through their doors, and helping them have the confidence to continue operating. Before I got there, one of the hospitals had padlocked its gates. They were so afraid. And even when we had an acute appendix, we couldn't get the patient in because they had a fever. So this was a mission to really try and get them on board, to help them feeling confident that they had the skills and knowledge and the equipment and training to operate safely in a really harrowing environment. And the guy with the blue beret on there was the hospital commander, not of the hospital that closed its doors. This hospital, the Bangladeshis kept their doors open, but they were very afraid, and it was a very worthwhile visit. So the UN gave me a helicopter for the day, and I got to fly out all over the Liberian jungles, and I desperately wanted to land and see what it was like, but they wouldn't let me do that. So I visited the different health sectors and met with teams like this. This young man would have been about 24 years old, and he was running one of the community care centres in the Ebola outbreak, which were basically the quarantine centres that they put people when they were doing contact tracing, and before the WHO's ring vaccine was available, they put people in these quarantine centres and they simply had to serve out their 21 days of quarantine. And if a single person in the quarantine centre developed Ebola, everybody's 21-day clock got reset. So it was a really very awful situation, but it was the only way they could contain the outbreak. And this centre was just starting. It had only 2 patients left by the time I visited them, and the outbreak was starting to look like it might come under control. It went on for another 6 months. Sometimes, and this is where it's about humility and learning, sometimes you learn in the most unexpected places. So I'd been given all of this information about this hospital in Guinea-Conakry, French Guinea in West Africa, that this hospital was terrible, that we shouldn't be sending anybody there, that they didn't know what they were doing, and anybody who went there would get Ebola. I went there and their planning was so impeccable that I took photographs of their map and their patient flow planning and used it for our clinics. So, you know, I walked in the door thinking that I was going to provide them with helpful advice, and I walked out the door having eaten a helpful slice of humble pie and with some really good approaches and thinking that we were able to apply. So my job is always about that, having my cup not so full that there's no room to receive any additional inputs. This is my team and I in New York, having done our Ebola PPE training. I'm the person hiding behind the fogged up glasses, but we hosted the General Assembly in New York at the height of the Ebola outbreak, and we had delegations from all of the Ebola countries coming. We had, you know, the instructions were the GA has to go ahead, these delegates have to be allowed to attend. So in headquarters, where we have responsibility for the medical support planning for the General Assembly, we had to be ready to receive and manage Ebola cases. And we, of course, had workforce returning from the Ebola outbreak as well. So we had to do our PPE training, and we continue to exercise in that. What I can say is that, and very few people in the world know this, New York City's first suspect Ebola case actually was a UN staff member. And we're very proud of the fact that that got no publicity. We managed to whisk that person out under cover of full PPE during the General Assembly week with the whole world's media assembled, and we somehow got them out under the radar. As it turned out, she didn't have Ebola, and the first real Ebola case was a few weeks later. But we gave the New York Health Services their first shakedown, and they discovered some of the problems in terms of their preparedness. So we contributed to the safe operations of New York in the outbreak as well. These are just a couple of pictures of Yemen. So this is the airport in Yemen that had been bombed and bombed and bombed. And this, on the side here, these are the blast screens on my accommodation, so that you have these really big, rigid plastic, well, they're not rigid, they're flexible but very thick plastic screens, so that if a mortar drops outside your window and the windows shatter inwards, you don't get hit by flying glass. So these are the operating conditions that our personnel in Yemen had, and one of the real challenges was that the norms of armed conflict were not being assiduously applied, and healthcare facilities, as you would all know, have been subject of intentional attacks. Our colleagues at MSF have been targeted on multiple occasions. There have been unacceptable levels of fatalities in MSF and the International Committee of the Red Cross operated facilities. So every morning after the bombing had happened, we would have to do an inventory again of what's the available healthcare in town, who is still in business. Sometimes we would ring and the phones wouldn't ring anymore. And that was just a really sobering reminder of the impact that taking out health infrastructure has. And an interesting piece of trivia: there are more deaths attributable to armed conflict that occur post-conflict than happen during conflict in terms of healthcare. And it is because of the destruction of health infrastructure. So people die during conflicts, that is known. But what is invisible is the toll that these unethical attacks on health infrastructure take. And there is a growing movement to see what we can do to better protect health infrastructure, so that when the conflict is over, at least there can be some semblance of a functioning healthcare system. This is one of the saddest things I've ever seen. These are the lights on the top of the big tertiary hospital in Sana'a in Yemen. And these lights were their protection. They hoped that the Saudi bombers would recognise this as a hospital and not bomb them. And to date, it has worked, but they knew that this didn't really offer real protection, and they also knew that they were walking a political tightrope, because if it became perceived that they were treating rebels, that they were treating the insurgents and dealing with them, then that might make them a target, because those norms of the Geneva Conventions are not being respected internationally. This is a funeral on the streets of Yemen. just going by. I don't take a lot of photographs in these sorts of circumstances because I don't like that feeling of being a voyeur, but sometimes documenting is important. And at the time I visited, no one in the world was talking about Yemen. It was this hidden conflict. No one was aware of it. And it has turned into one of the greatest humanitarian crises of our time. This is the Quality and Safety Board at the hospital that was fearing bombardment. So the next time you tell yourself that you don't have time or the right environment or the conditions precedent to attend to your safety and quality work, just remember my guys in Yemen. They were getting on with it, and I know, and absolute respect to them for doing that. They were so motivated and so determined not to lose the dignity of running a safe, high-quality facility to the very best of their ability, even when they ran out of dialysis fluid. They were still determined to do the very best that they could. This is the operating theatre in a little hospital in Mogadishu, and this was another lesson for me. I visited this facility. It's called what's going outside the wire. So the UN has a secure perimeter, and outside the wire you have to go with an armed security guard, helmet, flak jacket, armed vehicle, which sometimes feels pretty silly, especially when you're driving through a marketplace where kids are playing and we're all dressed up as though we're going to war. But they took me to this hospital, and I remember thinking, wow, that looks pretty basic. I'm not sure if you will recognise it, but in the back here, this is in lieu of piped oxygen or cylinder oxygen. It's just an oxygen concentrator, and that's what they had to perform their anaesthesia with. And it was one of the most basic facilities. This was just a little a tribute to the surgeon and his wife, who's a gynaecologist, for the services that they were providing. But I really just went there out of I'd been told that they'd been doing good work, and I visited them as an act of collegiality. 2 weeks after I visited, the UN compound came under attack, and we had it was a compound attack of a vehicle-borne IED followed by gunmen, and we had quite a few fatalities and a number of wounded. But the road between that site and our hospital became a battlefield between the insurgents and the UN peacekeepers. So we had to evacuate our staff backward. We couldn't go forward to our hospital. We had to go backward to that little hospital that I just showed you. And with that tiny operating theatre, with those facilities, this guy saved 6 of our people by just doing what he could. He just got on and did it. And that's why the work that you do resonates with me so much. Sometimes you know you're not the best person in the world, but you're the best person who is there. And you feel that what you have to offer isn't good enough, but it's the best good enough that's available on offer. And it takes courage to do that. It takes courage to put yourself out there. And what I saw in this place reminded me in many regards of the work that I had seen rural and remote practitioners doing in Australia. This is my colleague Dennis. On the other side, I was looking just like him with my helmet on. This is one of my 3 vehicles with armed guards that were escorting us through Mogadishu. This was a visit to a maternity unit that had a guns not allowed sign on the door, which is the first time I've ever seen that on a maternity unit window. And you can see one of my guards here. So they just set up a perimeter around so that the idea being that they'll stand between me and a potential kidnapper. It's an uncomfortable thought having other people put themselves at risk to keep you safe. And I know that a couple of my guards were among the ones who perished a couple of weeks later in the compound attack. So to do my job, I always pretty much have to be like this. But sometimes I have to look like this. I always try and find a way to work a picture of my dog into a talk. This is sometimes how I get treated, and that truly, they did put that red carpet down for me so that my dainty foot wouldn't have to touch the earth of India, which is just insane. So you can end up being treated like royalty, but you have to remain open to feedback. Those are really important things. And I do think as a profession, that applies equally to all of us as it does to me. We may not all get the red carpet put down, but the stature and privilege that we enjoy as medical practitioners can result in us being sometimes a little detached from reality. And that's where an honest receptivity to feedback is a really important part of the toolkit. Sometimes I just have to sit and wait, and sometimes I have to be very active. And I love showing this to non-Australian audiences. Sometimes I have to be a diplomat, and sometimes I have to get away from it all, because at heart I'm still a bit of a country girl, and so I regularly pack my tent and up and head off into the forest, where I'll exchange my bear stories for your crocodile stories at some point. So my Australian education gave me everything I needed to be able to do this job and do it well. I just needed to learn. General practice gave me breadth and depth, and further study in leadership and management gave me tools that I needed to change and lead a complex system. Working in Queensland Health and in Medicare taught me to navigate bureaucracy and remain optimistic and stubborn when the going gets tough. So what I would say, in other words, is that career stages give you the building blocks to do something extraordinary. It doesn't always have to be a single pathway, and the different choices that you make eventually come together into a unique you-flavoured cocktail that sets you up for something extraordinary. It's often the non-clinical skills that contribute. So community engagement, chairing committees, being involved in project management, these are all things that have stood me in good stead. And then I have a special note to the women in the audience. It's not to say that contributions from our male colleagues are not welcome, but one of the things I've really noticed since I went to work at the UN is the number of women who ask permission to apply for a job. It's like, can I apply? Stop waiting for people to tell you you're good enough. Don't stop trying to improve, but don't believe that because you can still improve, it means that you can't contribute. And don't ask for permission. Speak up. And this is where I think a comment from the newly minted Duchess, one of her comments of hers that I really like, Meghan Markle, who said that she gets sick of people saying women need to find their voice. She says that they have voices, they just need to use them. And that's true. And one other thing I would say is that when you're putting together working groups or committees, what we often see is that gender balance is achieved by having male doctors and female nurses. And that's not really going to cut it, because nurses are not female doctors, and female doctors do bring a different perspective to the table. So gender perspectives are incredibly important, and these comments would apply equally to other groups that are not necessarily the traditional face of medicine. So my comments here would also apply to people from non-English speaking backgrounds, to Indigenous Australians. It's wonderful to hear of the success of training and promoting Indigenous Australians in medicine. I remember the celebration when Australia graduated its first Indigenous medical student, and the fact that that was in my lifetime is both a travesty and a bit of a shock. So it's wonderful to hear that that has happened. So my summary advice, if I'm in a position to give any advice, is take risks, trust yourself, leap off the cliff. There's going to be something amazing at the bottom of it, and you never know where you could end up.
Stand here. Come here. That fascinating, and the gift that we're giving the keynote speakers are these beautiful hand-painted emu eggs, which have been locally done from Dreamtime Kalula art. There are a couple of great quotes out of that. We could stay here all day and hear more stories. Can you just come over next to the microphone, though? A couple of things that just come to mind. I'm not an expert in any one thing, and that breadth is actually a great strength, which I think is a really good thing for people to take with them. Too often in remote areas, doctors are seen as not just the doctor, but they're also seen as the consultant, as the physician, as the person who's the group psychiatrist, as the mate, as the coach, the footy team, all of those things.
Yep.
And that door has to open, and there's that, the struggle, just taking that element, the one question I want to ask, taking that element and taking it to an area where you just see nothing, where you've got everything at your hand, and then you've got nothing. What was the first initial reaction to that, to walk into a tent with zero facilities?
Really interesting and great question, because at first, and this is when I started to confront my biases, Because at first I walked in and my response was, oh, the poor things, they're doing the best that they can. And then I realised how patronising that was. And I've come to recognise that holding people to account for standards is actually an act of respect. And so initially I kind of thought, well, there's nothing I can do. There's nothing I can do here. But then it was to recognise that small things, even the smallest thing, like making sure that they have a stock of in-date antibiotics. The smallest thing could be the one thing that saves somebody's life. So initially it's the overwhelmed, and then it's the, well, I can't fix all of it at once, because I do love instant gratification. That's why I liked working in emergency medicine.
There's that messiah complex.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But then to just say, well, I can't fix everything, but this is one thing that we can fix today, and tomorrow we'll fix the next thing.
I think you walking into that situation in places like Yemen and Dadaar and kind of eating humble pie is a real shock, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It is, because you do, you know, my family, I'm a mixture of Australian and of English, Australian, Irish, and so, you know, I have that colonial background of coming in and we're going to save everybody. But I've learned a lot from the people I thought I was going to save.
So on that, you said that you've got that strength of character, but at the same time you say that some people don't actually put the strength of character in place. So they don't back themselves in enough.
Yeah.
And so while you have that initial strength of character, you say, no, I'm going to save people. But then when it comes to the crunch, you go, oh, I'm not really the right person to do that. And I read something interesting, maybe it was yesterday, or maybe it was at the airport, it was like, you believed in Santa Claus for 8 years, you can believe in yourself for 10 seconds.
Yes.
Yes. Sorry, spoiler alert.
Yeah, and Santa's real.
Yeah. He's dead. Oh, no. It's a man. No, sorry, that's the crying game.
Yes, quite. Yeah, and I guess it's a bit of a balancing act, and I still lurch a little bit. Some days I might overcook the self-belief. Yeah. And have to go back and eat the humble pie the next day. So it's about the versatility and about, I think the most important thing is an ability to reflect on what's working and what's not working. You know, and I've had my series of things that just didn't work, where I was causing conflict and causing pain and making people feel disrespected. And clearly I was then overcooking the messiah complex thing. But to approach people more humbly, but still with an intent to lead them to a different place, but respecting where they actually are and seeing what's strong about where they are, so that you don't throw that out as you try to pull them to a different place, but you pull them with their strengths to where you want them to be. Yeah.
Fascinating, and it's made me think that while you're worrying about mortar-proof glass protecting your life, and I'm complaining that there isn't a packet of Pringles in my minibar, that life needs to be rethought. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Dr. Jillann Farmer.